who had learned their jazz, taken every opportunity to play with visiting Americans, and were considered on the level of some of the best American players in this period. So you've got jazz musicians as cultural ambassadors. You've got global artists using jazz. Then you also have jazz musicians interpreting cultural influences from around the globe, for which we go to our next fact. This is a performance from 1961 by what at the time was the John Coltrane Sextet. It's called India, and it's from a very famous recording he made at the Village Vanguard. It's an example of how global influences were starting to shape the music of some of the greatest American musicians. Coltrane had been fascinated by Indian music, and particularly by its static harmonic environment, which was very close to the kind of modal experiments that he had started indulging himself in with Miles Davis, and then carried over to his own group. You may be familiar with John Coltrane's son, Ravi, who was named after the great Indian musician Ravi Shankar. And it was from Coltrane's fascination with Indian music that some of his music arose in this period. So as I say, this is India. Now, musical scholars could tell you that it's fairly far removed from Indian music and perhaps a fairly simplistic application. But of course, it's being assimilated into the basic jazz concept that Coltrane had imparted to his group. And I think you can hear the suggestions of Indian music even if it's not towing the line hard and fast. But there were other influences as well, none more famous than this next one. He says, as he tries to get to the next play. This was done within 3 months of the last performance by another great tenor saxophonist, Stan Getz, and guitarist Charlie Bird. And this is probably the most famous, most obvious example of global culture having an influence on jazz. This is the first American bossa nova recording, the first popular bossa nova hit in the United States. It's the Antonio Carlos Jobim composition, Desafinado, which Charlie Bird, the guitar player, had heard in South America while on a State Department tour a year earlier. Brought the music back, and he, Getz, and 3 other Americans made this recording called Jazz Samba, and suddenly a new music craze was created. And probably, if we look at specific cultures having influence on jazz after Afro-Cuban music, the Brazilian samba might be cited as having the greatest influence on jazz. So you see, now we're in the 1960s, there's a lot of information flowing back and forth. The technology is making it easier to exchange these ideas. And suddenly, musicians are starting to arise all over the world who are having an impact as first-line creators and influences themselves. This became particularly prevalent as jazz picked up the influences of rock and pop music in the late 60s and 1970s. And music was created known as fusion. And probably for a style of jazz, no style has had more innovative, non-American born artists than fusion. We're listening to a piece from the first Weather Report album called Morning Lake. And I selected this one because it was composed by the bassist Miroslav Vitas, who's Czech. And Czechoslovakia and jazz have a very interesting relationship. I mentioned in reading from the book how jazz represents freedom in oppressed societies. After the Prague Spring and the clampdown in Czechoslovakia, the first wave of protest was begun in the Musicians Union when a group of musicians created what they called the jazz section. And they had very strict rules in the Musicians Union about what kind of sections you could create, because jazz was considered decadent music, and as to how many people could be in the section. And they had specific limits on the number of members the jazz section could have. And of course, the membership was far exceeded the limitations. And this was one of the first signs of resistance, if you will, in Czechoslovakia. So we have Miroslav Vidas, the bassist, who composed it. One of the leaders and really the guiding force of Weather Report, Joe Zawinul, was from Vienna. He's the keyboard player. The percussionist, Ayrton Moreira, was from Brazil. So you had a Czech, an Austrian, a Brazilian, and then the band was completed by two Americans, Wayne Shorter on saxophone, Alphonse Mouzon on drums. Not an untypical situation in the 1970s and on up to the present day, as students, particularly from all over the world, come to this country to learn the music. Many come to the Boston area to study at Berklee College of Music or the New England Conservatory. Many go to New York. They stay, they share their ideas, and they create their own approaches. And I'll just end with a little bit of a track from an album that I think was among the top 3 or 5 albums of the year by a alto saxophonist named Miguel Zinan from Puerto Rico, now teaching at the New England Conservatory and a MacArthur Fellow last year. And this is Via Palmeras, the first track from his most recent album, Esta Plana. And what he has done is he's taken his band, which, to look at the profile, 2 Puerto Ricans, Miguel and his drummer, a piano player from Venezuela, a bass player from Austria, and added a trio of Puerto Rican plena musicians to create a hybrid of jazz and music from his culture. This is not the exception anymore. This is a central stream in jazz creation today, and this is why we end up at a point of truly global music, I think. So with that, I thank you for your attention and your time.
So a century of jazz from around the world. A couple years ago, I was in China with a group of people from Boston. We were in Beijing, we were in Shanghai, and then we were in the beautiful city of Hangzhou, which is on West Lake. And when you think about Hangzhou, you've probably seen, if you've not been to China, you've probably seen beautiful paintings and photographs of Hangzhou. West Lake is the lake that you'll see with beautiful hills in the background, with beautiful temples on the hills, with Chinese boats in the lake and weeping willows coming into the lake. We were walking around on the second or third evening we were there, and we came around a corner, and there was the jazz club. Everything else was in Chinese characters except for the letters JZs. So we got in there, and it turned out that it was almost all young kids between the ages of maybe 18 or 19 and maybe 25 or 26. Most of them in college who were Zhejiang University, which is one of the major international universities in Hangzhou. And they were just loving jazz. And you looked around and you saw these big, beautiful black and white photographs of jazz greats like Benny Goodman and Gene Krupa. What was most interesting is that I started talking with some of my colleagues, some of our interpreters who were there, and they said that during the Cultural Revolution, jazz was outlawed. In fact, the sheet music was burned, was torn up. Instruments were destroyed. You couldn't get a tenor saxophone to save your life because these were considered, instruments that were decadent. And now they had this incredible blossoming of music. Well, what's also important about all of this is it's an industry. It's a fairly large industry. And Ted Kurland is going to tell us a little bit about the jazz industry from the inside. Ted?
Thank you, Gary. Well, the topic of the globalization, the evolution of the globalization of the jazz music industry and the music industry in general is a story that's best told in an anecdotal way, I think, with some history, tracking alongside it the technological advancements that occurred that significantly influenced what we in the music industry do. And I can tell you that whenever I tell this story to my two sons, they cannot believe I'm as old as the details make me out to be. But I started as a booking agent in Boston in the early 70s. And at that time, what we had available for communication, as you probably all know, was the telephone. And every long-distance call had a significant cost to it. We had the ability to mail pieces of promotional materials, and at that time, we had to print, and I think this was before, this was right when Xerox was coming out. We pretty much had to print everything with ink at that time. Mm-hmm. And I started out working in a small geographic area, New England. And what I had to do to promote and market the artists that I was working with was I had to call colleges and universities and sponsors, and then I would have to I would have to hand type a contract or promotional letters and send them out individually. And at that time, in terms of geographic proximity, you can imagine New England for a young college student just starting out was a large undertaking. But that's all. That was the scope and the scale of what was going on in those days in business, and that's where the technology was. As the late 70s approached and the early 80s, I started expanding geographically. I started booking the artists that I was working with all over the United States. But it was still, at that time, there were no jazz booking agencies in the United States. There was a number of individuals who were basically one-person, two-person operations. And we had, at that time, very limited resources to market the artists that we were working with. As time went on, it occurred to me that it would be challenging and interesting to try to work internationally. But there were literally no U.S. agents booking jazz overseas. There was one producer who was producing his own tours and taking them overseas, and that was someone whose name may be very familiar to some of you, George Weed. George Weed originated the Newport Jazz Festival, grew up in Newton, and George would literally go over to Europe and find places for the performers to play, and he would produce the tours at his risk himself, because there was no other way for them to go over, other than the occasional State Department tour that Bob and Barry alluded to.